Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Jason Trennard.
Oh, yeah.
And this is a really fascinating one because we're looking at an interview he did in South Korea
Okay.
right after the 2024 election.
Wow.
So talk about a moment in time, right?
Yeah. Very, very interesting time to get his take.
To get his perspective on things like, how is a Trump presidency going to impact trade,
Right.
inflation, your portfolio, what are the hidden costs of globalization?
Mm-hmm.
Who really benefits from this whole system?
Yeah.
Is there really no alternative to the U.S. stock market,
Okay.
even though valuations seem high?
Interesting.
And what does a commercial real estate guy know about economic policy anyway?
Yeah, that's a great question.
So a lot to unpack here, but I think starting with this idea of the Trump trade,
Okay.
right? We hear this phrase tossed around a lot. What does it actually mean beyond just the catchy name?
Well, I think Trennard has a really interesting perspective on this, particularly because of his own personal connections to Trump's economic team.
Okay.
And, he describes Trump as a commercial real estate guy.
Okay.
At heart, always looking for a deal.
Right.
And so this leads him to believe that, Trump's use of tariffs
Okay.
is less ideological and more of a negotiating tactic.
Oh.
So a tool in his deal-making arsenal.
So it's about leverage.
Exactly.
Using these tariffs to kind of force other countries into better agreements with the U.S.
Precisely.
Okay.
But here's where I think his analysis gets really nuanced.
Okay.
He really makes a distinction between broad tariffs,
Mm-hmm.
which he believes are highly inflationary,
Okay.
and targeted tariffs, which he argues simply shift relative prices.
Oh, okay. So give me an example. What kind of targeted tariffs are we talking about?
Well, he suggests, focusing on things like semiconductors or rare earth minerals,
Okay.
things that are, really crucial for technology and manufacturing. And by strategically targeting those sectors, he argues the U.S. could gain leverage
Oh, sure.
in trade negotiations without, triggering widespread price increases across the board.
So it's about being much more precise?
Precisely.
Got it.
Rather than just kind of, slapping tariffs on everything.
Right. And this ties directly into one of his big concerns, right?
Absolutely.
Inflation.
Yes.
And, he's sounding the alarm for a potential second wave that he believes isn't being fully captured
Right.
in the official numbers.
Yeah. I remember him talking about growing up in the 70s.
Yeah?
And how his family, had to make really difficult choices due to rising costs.
Right.
And it makes you realize that inflation is not just some abstract economic concept.
Right.
It has real-world
It affects people.
consequences for everyday people. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And that kind of personal experience, I think, really informs his perspective on how we even measure inflation.
Yeah.
Right? Because he argues that basket of goods
Yeah.
that we traditionally use to calculate inflation
The traditional basket.
doesn't actually reflect
Right.
the price pressures that most people are actually facing.
Exactly.
So what's in his alternative basket?
Well, he focuses on the essentials, food, energy, housing, childcare, healthcare,
Yeah,
the things that, pretty much everyone needs, regardless of income level.
right.
And he contends that, the prices of these essential items have been rising much faster than wages,
Okay.
meaning that the average person's purchasing power
Is eroding.
is being eroded.
People are feeling the squeeze, even if the official numbers
Right.
don't really reflect it.
Yeah, and he points to government spending and deficits as a key driver of this.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's particularly concerned about, the fact that the U.S. is running such high deficits, even with low unemployment,
Right.
suggesting that the bill for all this spending
Is going to come due.
will eventually come due. Exactly.
And in what form does he see that bill coming due?
Well, he believes it will likely manifest in the form of higher interest rates,
Okay.
which could, further strain household budgets and potentially dampen economic growth.
So that brings us to his view on the U.S. stock market then.
Mm-hmm.
Given all these inflationary pressures,
Yeah,
potential economic headwinds,
right.
is he bearish?
Well, not entirely. He uses this really interesting phrase, bullish until the bill comes due.
Okay.
So he acknowledges the difficulty of achieving, those double-digit returns
Right.
in the current market environment, given the high valuations we're seeing.
So a cautious optimism?
Yes, but with an emphasis on specific opportunities.
Okay.
He sees particular potential in sectors like AI and nuclear energy.
Oh, interesting. So instead of shying away from these potentially volatile sectors,
Right.
he's saying those might be the places to watch.
It's about understanding the underlying dynamics driving those sectors and recognizing, the potential for growth,
Yeah.
even amidst broader economic uncertainty.
Okay.
And this leads us to his evolving perspective on this idea of TINA.
Okay.
There is no alternative.
Right. So this idea that even if the U.S. stock market isn't perfect, it's still the best game in town.
Right.
Compared to other options.
Exactly. He previously believed that TINA was dead.
Okay.
Meaning there were viable alternatives.
Right.
But, with rising inflation concerns and geopolitical risks in other regions, he's now suggesting that equities might be the best option, even with the high valuation.
But he's not saying go all in on stocks.
No. He emphasizes the importance of diversification.
Okay.
Especially with hard assets like real estate, gold, commodities, as hedges against inflation.
So a balanced approach to navigate these uncertain times.
Exactly.
Now let's shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
And talk about China.
Right.
What's Trener's take on how a Trump presidency might impact U.S.-China relations?
Yeah.
And the global economic landscape?
Right. Well, this is where I think it gets really interesting because he points out that a lot of investors are already wary of China, due to concerns about property rights and potential government intervention.
Yeah, so you're not just betting the company.
Exactly.
Or the market, but
you're making a political bet.
On the Chinese government.
Right, and it's a bet that a lot of people are increasingly hesitant to make.
Especially with the Trump presidency.
Particularly with Trump's more confrontational stance, yeah.
So where does that leave investors then?
Well, he highlights India as a potential beneficiary of this shift. He sees U.S. manufacturers exploring diversification of their supply chains, potentially moving away from China, even if it means higher costs in the short term.
So almost a retreat from globalization.
Yeah, in a sense.
As we've known it.
Right. It doesn't mean the end of global trade or interconnectedness, but rather a shift towards maybe more regionalized or localized production and consumption.
It's like the pendulum swinging back a bit.
Exactly.
Not a complete reversal, but a recalibration.
A recalibration, yeah.
So what does that mean for the global economic landscape then?
Well, it has, significant implications. It could lead to new alliances and partnerships as countries seek to secure access to resources and markets.
So a reconfiguration of the chessboard.
Exactly.
Winners and losers.
Winners and losers, yeah.
And that brings us to another key player, right?
Yes.
The Fed.
The Federal Reserve.
What's his take on that?
Well, he expresses some skepticism that the Fed will ease as much as the market expects.
So he's not buying into this idea?
Not necessarily, no.
That central banks will always come to the rescue?
Right. He thinks they might need to maintain a more hawkish stance. Meaning keeping interest rates higher for longer to combat inflation.
So for those who aren't familiar with that term, what does a hawkish monetary policy actually mean?
Well, it essentially means prioritizing the fight against inflation. Overstimulating economic growth. Higher interest rates make it more expensive for businesses to borrow money and invest.
Right.
Which can slow down economic activity, but also helps to, cool down rising prices.
A balancing act.
A balancing act, yeah.
He did mention the Plaza Accord.
Yes.
That agreement back in the 80s to devalue the dollar.
He doesn't see that as likely in the near term. He thinks the U.S. government might be more inclined to take the approach of our currency, your problem.
Right.
Essentially letting the strong dollar impact other economies while prioritizing domestic concerns.
So a potential for more friction.
It's a possibility.
Less cooperation.
Yeah. And this ties back to that broader theme of deglobalization, right? This potential shift away from multilateralism toward more nationalistic economic policies.
It's fascinating how he connects all these pieces together.
He's a master at seeing the big picture.
Trade inflation, China, the Fed.
The interconnectedness of it all.
And it's not just about analyzing the data points in isolation.
Right.
But understanding those underlying trends.
The dynamics, yeah.
I do want to touch on something before we get to the final takeaway. He mentioned how his own personal experiences growing up in the 70s, during that period of high inflation, really shaped his understanding.
Yeah, he talked about how those formative years instilled in him a real awareness of how economic forces can impact people's lives on a very personal level.
It's a reminder that economics isn't just about theories and charts and graphs.
Absolutely.
It's about people's lives.
Real-world impacts, yeah.
Their ability to provide for their families,
right.
to build a future.
He brings that human element to his analysis, for sure.
Yeah, and speaking of that, I think there's a final takeaway here.
All right.
A question that he didn't explicitly address, but I think emerges from his insights.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
If globalization is truly in retreat, as he suggests it might be, what does that mean for the future of international cooperation?
That's a profound question.
Because for decades, the prevailing narrative has been that globalization fosters cooperation.
Right, it benefits everyone.
But what if that narrative starts to unravel?
Exactly. If countries are increasingly prioritizing national interests over global collaboration, what are the consequences?
For things like climate change,
right,
pandemic,
economic crises.
How do we solve these problems?
Yeah, it raises these fundamental questions about how we navigate a world that's becoming increasingly interconnected, yet potentially more fragmented in terms of economic and political alliances.
And that's why I think it's so crucial to engage with these ideas.
Absolutely.
To explore different perspectives.
To challenge our own assumptions.
To be informed and adaptable.
Precisely.
Like Trennert encourages us to be.
And that's what makes these deep dives so valuable.
Right.
They allow us to step back from the daily news cycle.
Yeah.
And grapple with the bigger picture.
Connect the dots.
Recognize the pattern.
Develop a more nuanced understanding.
Of the global economy and its impact on our lives.
Well said.
Well, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the mind of Jason Trennert.
Yeah, it's like we're building this mental model of the global economy.
A mental map.
Yeah, understanding the terrain.
The risks.
The opportunity.
And that map helps us, make more informed decisions in our own lives.
In our businesses.
Exactly. Equips us to navigate uncertainty.
Right.
And hopefully seize those opportunities that align with our goals.
So for you listening, I encourage you to keep exploring these ideas. Dig into Trennert's work.
Absolutely.
Read up on deglobalization. Keep asking those tough questions.
Because in a world that's constantly changing, your ability to learn, adapt, to think critically, that's our most valuable asset.
Trennert's insights give us this framework for understanding the forces at play. But it's up to each of us to apply that knowledge to our own situations.
Absolutely make the decisions that are right for you.
And who knows, maybe you'll come up with your own brilliant insights to share.
That's what we love to see.
All right, well, that wraps up our deep dive into the mind of Jason Trennert.
Until next time.
Stay curious and keep exploring. I'm not going to start